It really wasn't until I left their home and was living in Milwaukee and buying my food in a grocery store. I couldn't eat the food. It was flat. It had no life to it. This was in the mid-'70s, and we didn't have organic food readily available, as all of you know, because so many of you in this room have been a huge part of getting us to where we are today, as far as organic being so readily available now. So there I was. I had to grow my own food to be able to eat it. I knew what real food tastes like because I grew up with it. And so I wanted to be a farmer, and I did not have a clue how I would get started. I was dealing with everything young people deal with today. How would I ever get land? Interest rates were going through the roof. How could I buy land? How could I get education? And so I decided, well, I just have to do associated type of work. You know, you just take that first step on whatever direction you're trying to head. So first I worked in Florida and Washington State as a fruit picker. And boy, did I learn how to work. When you get paid 60 cents a bushel and you're climbing ladders in orchards that they called organic, but really they were organic by default in the 70s. They were orchards that were abandoned, and the grass wasn't mowed. It was 10 feet tall, and there were snakes in there, and we had moved ladders, and there wasn't a whole lot of fruit. So I learned a lot about what do I have to do to actually have a farm that truly is organic, so I'm getting yields that make sense. And then I worked as a produce manager. And that was the best job I could have ever had because I totally understood then what does the buyer need. If I'm going to be a farmer, what do I have to make sure I'm doing to really satisfy my customer? And I got to thinking of my customer at that point as the audience. These aren't just people that are consuming. There's someone I was having a relationship with, and it was an audience that I was speaking to. So that became incredibly important. I was still trying to figure out how in the world I'd ever start a farm, but I was learning all these skills and getting on that path to becoming one. And then one day I was driving down the road in Minnesota, and there was this sign, turn here, sweet corn. And I just whooped right in that driveway, and there was everything I was looking for, that flash of red tomatoes, that scent of basil, and a very handsome Minnesota bachelor farmer. Sometimes you just have to have a little trust, right? And so before long, I was farming with Martin. We actually played really hard to get with each other. He had been farming on his family's land for about 12 years. He started in 1973, so before his farm could thrive as a business, he had to be part of writing the early organic standards that we used in Minnesota, and the infrastructure, the markets, all of that all of you have gone through, and it's been a long haul. And so this playing hard to get was kind of funny because he'd say to me, "Do you want to farm?" And I'd say, "Well, I want to, but I got to figure out how I'm going to earn some money." And then I'd say to him, "Do you want to farm?" He'd say, "No, there's no money in it." And then we just planted a little garden, and next thing I knew, all of a sudden we were farming. It was just pulled on us, and we couldn't not do it. It happened to us more so than that we happened to it. But this land that we first started farming on is what I really want to tell you about. It was fifth generation land in his family. They were the first people on it since the native people had been pushed off it. It's 120 acres, and it had never been monocropped. It had maybe 30 acres of tillable land, and this is a picture from that farm. You can see how incredibly diverse it was. Those fields were just small and slipped in. And the rest of that land still had an intact ecosystem. There were always 2-3 flowers blooming at any single time. There was crab apples, there was sumac, there were berries, there were birds. There were so many birds there. And as a young woman starting out, I just took that for granted. I mean, grade school, probably 4th grade, you learn about ecosystem services. We weren't saying those phrases at this point in time. We didn't turn on the radio and hear biological diversity and ecosystem service like we do today. And so I didn't really understand what was happening as a farm. Here we had this incredible biological diversity. I actually thought, wow, organic farming is way easier than I thought it would be. You know, it was hard work physically. We planted, we weeded, we harvested, we sold. But I was young and energetic and doing this thing I really wanted to do. The part that was easy was our pests, our disease, our fertility, our irrigation. It was largely being managed by the diversity of an intact ecosystem. And it wasn't something I could visibly see. And I didn't intellectually know. This information and research was not readily available at the time. So I saw it happening and was benefiting from all of these services provided by our ecosystem. We had soil building systems to manage our fertility of the soil, that managed our irrigation because it made our soils hold the water better. The first little inkling I got of it was one day when I found a great horned tomato worm. And it had this it looked like rice sticking out all over the length of the body of this worm, and the worm was kind of withering. I actually watched it die. And I was I was kind of standing back, I was a little afraid of it. And I went to research, what was going on here, and I learned that these were eggs of a parasitic wasp that had been laid into this worm and killed the worm. So it started this whole exploration for me of, well, what is this parasitic wasp? Where does it live? And that was when I first started to realize what this land was actually serving as far as us as farmers and taking care of our pest issues, because we really didn't have many pest issues. When we saw them, they were pretty minor. And then we had kids, Martin and I had kids, so that brought a whole new element of the farm to me because my kids were having the experience I had as a kid, growing up on the land, learning about the life process, through being in the fields, through being part of planting and caring for these crops, and being at our business. They learned how to have relationships with our audience instead of thinking of them just as customers at that roadside stand. Now, we were the last farm left in the city of Eagan, Minnesota, which at this point in time was the fastest growing suburb in Minnesota. And one day we got a letter informing us that the city of Eagan needed 20 of the 120 acres for a school. But you can't really say no to a school district, right? And to make it harder, we didn't actually own the land. It was owned by Martin's 4 cousins. We owned 1 acre where our house was and our greenhouse and our roadside stand, and then we rented land in the family. This was land that Martin had grown up on. And for Martin, when he was a child growing up, this community was the green belt of Minneapolis and St. Paul. This is where the food came from since the 1850s to feed a major metropolitan area. Most of his neighbors, as when he was a child, had 10 acres, 20 acres, and delivery routes in the cities. They had keys to people's kitchens. They went in and took the food in. So he grew up seeing what it meant to be a city, and was now the last farm left. So when this letter came and we knew that we had to give up 20 acres, we thought, well, we still have 100 acres, and they'll be over there, and we'll be over here, and we can make this work. And we still had these fields adjacent to the development. But what then happens is the sewer and water services to serve the school have to cross the farm to get to the school. And now the land is more valuable because it can be developed. They didn't recognize it as already developed as a diverse, successful, organic farm feeding the community. And so sewer and water assessments are placed against it. These are really hard decisions that, this is not an unusual story. It's happened to a vast majority of our farmland close to urban areas in the United States. Those sewer and water assessments are placed against it. In this case, you don't have to pay them until you sell the land, but there was 11% interest, which 7 years, that doubles. So $1 million owed becomes $2 million owed. And in another 7 years, you owe $4 million. So those 4 cousins had a heck of a time deciding what to do. Do we sell now, or we pay the assessments? If we wait, we might owe more than it's ever going to be worth. 2 of them wanted to sell, 2 did not want to sell. They did an amazing job of staying in relationship as they worked through this problem. But they did decide they had to sell. And what happened next completely changed my life. There I was, a young mom with 2 kids, wanting to be a farmer, thinking I'd put my whole dream together and not really understanding the complexity of ecosystems. So we were allowed to continue to farm on the land until it was developed. And they did the development process over a period of 3 years. So it meant they took a third, and then a third, and then a third. And what we farmed on was adjacent to that. Well, you know, they come in, they take every tree, every bush, every blade of grass. They even sold the living soil. We were farming adjacent to land that had no life. We experienced an ecological collapse. Our plants were overrun by disease and pests. When it would rain, there wasn't any life to take the water in, and it just ran off onto our crops with soil along with it and buried them. And there was something else happening that was even deeper and older. This oldest human need of our relationship with land that goes back as long as human beings have been on land and eaten from land and served by land, which was that this was the land where my children learned about the land process. It was the whole world as they knew it. And they were learning that the divine would not always be protected. They were learning that their parents weren't all-powerful beings that could stop bad things from happening. As young kids, they had special little forts next to every field. Maybe it was just a tree, we maybe didn't see it, maybe it was a rock. But to them, it was where they went when they needed a private moment with God, and they sat and had their space, and they were watching it be destroyed. So a day came where I found my son. He was about 2, standing on the edge of our acre, his little toes up on that line on our side, watching those bulldozers go back and forth. It seemed so senseless, and he looked so calm and peaceful, just his eyes moving, watching them. And I stood there watching him, and all of a sudden he just exploded, kicking and screaming, swearing, hitting against this loss that was so much bigger than him, but for the entire world. And I touched his back. I said, I'm here, just go for it. And he picked up dirt and threw it, clumps. They would hit the ground and crumble, mere dust, against the void of something that he was so powerless against. This went on for a long, long time. He couldn't stop until he just became weak, and I picked him up. I held him to my chest. I said, let it go, don't hang on to it. We'll get to the other side of this. And what came up and out of him then was a wailing, a grieving that was so much bigger than could have been in this little body, but it was completely of him and from him, and a loss for something so large. And eventually he fell asleep, or like asleep. I don't think he was asleep. I don't really know where he was. He was there a long time. When he came back, he was serene. And he said, Mom, when can we go again and look for farms for sale? And Mom, what kind of tree do you love the most? He said, I love oaks and apples and hawthorns and sumac. When he said, I knew he would get through it and connect to new land and be okay. But as easy as it is to hear this story and see so visually why the loss of biological diversity matters, it's really important to remind ourselves that it's actually not development that's the leading cause of habitat degradation and species extinction. It's agriculture. 39% of our land use is for agriculture. 70% of fresh water, 80% of deforestation is agriculture. This isn't news to you. You all live in agricultural regions. You know that we have an agricultural system in the United States, based on trying to have one species in a field. We spray to kill the insects, the weeds. We don't want any of these other species here. This that like for a piece of land, when it's not protected? We know what happens. We've seen it on our own farms. We've seen it on our neighbors' farms when we haven't had the right protection there. We know what a difference it makes when we have organic systems that are truly considering the biological diversity of that land and making sure that soil is protected through the winter, through the growing period, through the reconstruction period. We know that, putting an agricultural crop on a field is inherently degenerative. It's not how nature works these systems. So we have to think about, what are we doing different? It's what we've been doing in organic from the start. That's how vegetables are grown in the United States, in fields of plastic. This is from California, the green baskets of the United States, where 90% of the fresh greens come from. And they've been demanded by buyers to remove all their conservation habitat in the name of food safety. Well, the truth of the matter, that makes food less safe. Those conservation habitats are shown in research to filter E. coli and protect the water. Those wind belts, they capture dust that's pathogen laden and prevent it from getting on the food. So by trying to rip all this habitat out, we're actually making our food less safe. We know that when we plant diverse systems in our fields, it attracts beneficial species, and that it helps us with our pest management. You can say the same thing in our feedlot systems, where we have one species versus animals on pasture and a diverse system. So what do we do as farmers? And what I want to really ask of you today is to really recognize that relationship that you have with the land that you are on. You are the link between that land and the people who benefit from it. You're the ones that know why this stuff matters. You see it in your everyday lives. You have the opportunity to really talk to people about what you're experiencing on your farm. It can be a big story, it can be a little story, it can be something as small as seeing tomato worm with parasitic wasp larvae coming out of it. People are fascinated to hear these stories, and they do matter. And sometimes the stories are ugly. Sometimes we do have to talk about the problems. Where I live, 55% of the wells have nitrate levels above the safe drinking standards. That's blue babies, that's people being sick. Most of that is coming from agricultural land. It doesn't have anything growing on it for almost half of the season and is very vulnerable to leaching. That water, that nitrate doesn't stay there, it runs into the river. We know all of that. We've got great research showing that organic farms have significantly less nitrates leaving them. So we know these systems do make a difference. We know that this billions of pounds of synthetic pesticides, again, to keep this monocrop system going, cause a lot of problems for the race. The people who are invisible to us are these migrant workers. And acute pesticide poisoning is a very big issue in their life. The deformity rates for these people are very high. This is a really expensive price to pay for cheap food. Very expensive for someone. So it's really important that we talk about these problems with a focus on the solutions. If we just talk about some of the ugliness of this, people lose hope and they don't know how to engage. They have to be able to see what they can do about it and how that might make a difference. Great research has come out of Rodale where they did side-by-side trials showing 30 years now. They started in '87, so it's almost a 30-year trial. And they found that organic systems had 15 to 28% more carbon sequestration. That's a big deal when we're talking about how we can get carbon out of the atmosphere to address with weather changes, etc. Organic farms use less energy. That's a big deal when we're talking about how we're going to propel ourselves into the future. They emit less greenhouse gas. These are part of the solution. Organic is part of the solution. And you guys can really talk about that. Organic has higher yields in droughts. We've certainly seen this on our farm. For every 1% of organic matter, that soil holds another 16,500 gallons of water. When I say that statistic, to the average American, they take note. That's interesting to them. What does that mean, they want to know? How does that affect me as a farmer? I tell them, for every 1% of organic matter, that's a whole extra week I can go without irrigating my crops. That's huge. I get 4%. I literally can't go 4 weeks on many of my crops in my deep prairie loadings. So these systems that we've developed in organic are become really fundamental for all of agriculture, and we need to be talking about them. And so telling your story, whether it's to a customer, we had a direct market relationship with our customers, so we could bring these stories into our products in the market. Many of you may be selling more of a commodity type of crop. You still have lots of relationships, whether it's people you see at church, whether it's somebody at the elevator, or wherever you're selling. The people around you. Talk about what's happening on your farm, what you've noticed, what you've seen, how it's made a difference. And tell the story from your own experience. I like to tell the story based on something that happened to me, maybe something that I used to believe or what I once thought, and then this thing that happened and what I believe now. That way I'm not saying you should know this or you should change, which is threatening to people and they get self-defensive. I'm just talking about some experience I had. And that's a lot safer, easier for them to hear it. If they can identify with some part of my story, it's easier for them to hear it. And so we did find a new farm. Before we got to our new farm, we spent 6 years where the bulldozers were right up to our 1 acre, renting 22 properties with a 30-mile radius. So it was just a managerial nightmare. We had a little parade of transplanter and water truck and all of this stuff. We had to take to these different fields because we couldn't find a large piece of organic land. We were really just finding 2 acres here or 1 acre there that had fallen out of someone's system and was certifiable. It wasn't in great shape land. It hadn't had our years and years of soil building. We were just making do until we could get to the other side. And so when we finally found our farm, not easy finding a used farm. As you all know, there are no new farms out there. We find a used farm, and lots of problems with used farms that you got to think about before you buy them. So we found this 100 acres of deep black prairie loam, and it was being farmed from one end to the other. You can see how that waterway going right through the middle. That now today, it often has 2-3 feet of water standing in it. They were plowing right through it, one crop. And it was so compacted, the water couldn't enter when it rained. It would just sit in puddles or run off into the waterways, taking soil and nitrates and fertility with it. So we knew that before we could even take a crop off this land, we had to give it a break. And we had to bring the life back to it. The life had been taken out of it. So we took it out of production for 3 years. We just said, we're not even going to take cash crops off this land once in transition. We're just going to spend 3 years getting it in shape and continue to farm on our 22 different plots with the 30-mile radius. So now we just got to add a whole other plot to take care of during that period of time. But the first thing we had to do was, where does the water flow? We walked that piece of land in raincoats and heavy rains and staked out where the water flowed. We got it covered. It was not covered at all or protected. And we had to deal with the soil health. It was so compacted, and we put it through 3 years of soil building programs of adding organic matter to the soil and animal compost and bringing that soil health back and that microbial activity. We had to address the biological diversity. It had been basically removed from this land. There wasn't any. So for a vegetable farm, that means bringing in beneficial flowers and grasses, creating beetle banks in our fields so that there's a place for the dung beetles and all these other species, the parasitic wasps, that do so much of the work of managing pests and keeping them healthy. And then we had to address crop diversity. We couldn't have one large field. We created 53 small fields with biological life between them. So it was a big change that this piece of land went through in a 14-year period. And in 2005, when I was sitting down to do our winter planning and, doing the spreadsheets, how much did I sell that year, how many pounds, how many dollars, who did you go to, all that great stuff that we ask every year, I asked a question I'd never asked before, and it was, how many people did we feed? How many servings did we put on the table? It was a whole new way for me to think about it, and it was a different story to engage in with people, because that food on the table, that was relationships. That's people coming together and being family or friends at the same table. That's that oldest human need that we all have of how will we eat. It's not that long ago that humans had massive famine and starvation and death because of lack of food. It's the oldest human need of where will I get my food. And I came up with 3 million servings. 3 million servings had come off of this farm of food. And that picture was such a big change for me. I started thinking about how do I bring that into the conversation I'm having with our audience. And this was a sign that we had in the stores that we sold to. The stores would write in that little bubble, you know, Martin planted yesterday. The sweet corn just emerged, or first tassel, first silk, or Atina will be here tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock with the first sweet corn. It created this relationship. So when I figured out this 3 million servings, I asked Martin that winter, what is goodwill? What kind of goodwill do we have as a farm with the people that eat the food? And I didn't really get an answer. It was more that I raised the question. But I got an answer real quick after, because that spring, I was just in from planting kale. My hands were still stained green from handling the transplants. I was sitting at my desk, opening the mail, and there were 3 letters from somebody called Mincan. And I looked at it and I thought, Mincan, man, must be from Minnesota, right? And Can's kind of like, yes, we can. So I thought they were from a food shelf. I threw them in the trash. Like, I was sort of annoyed. Why did they send me 3? They could have just sent me 1, right? So like, they're not even going to get my attention into the trash and go. I thought, well, maybe I should just look at one. I pulled it out and I opened it up. And it wasn't a food shelf. It was a crude oil pipeline company owned by Koch Industries. And they were writing to inform us that they were planning to build a crude oil pipeline and that it would be crossing our farm. And by the way, we'll need extra land from you to build a pumping station. So my heart just stopped. I mean, I already knew what happened when bulldozers rolled through the land. I knew we would never farm on that land again with high quality vegetable crops. And then put a pumping station there too. Am I going to go to my customers and say, oh, by the way, there's a crude oil pumping station on our farm? It was the end of our farm. And I was no longer just the young, energetic 24-year-old who just thought everything was easy. I really didn't have anything to start over again. So I'm really embarrassed to tell you the very first thing I did, which was run down to the machine shop where Martin was working on a tractor and wave those letters in his face and spit the whole thing out. And then I went into this like 30-minute long spiel about the fact that he should call the pipeline up and what he should tell them when he called them about why they couldn't put the pipeline in. And he, of course, just looked at me and shook his head and said, you know, they put these things where they want. And you have all the answers, you call them. And this is the part that's so embarrassing, because I said, but they'll listen to you better because you're a man. I really believed it in that moment, and he actually knew better, that I was actually the better person for the job. I actually had the skills that were needed better than he did, and I was also really bad, which is necessary. So he said, yeah, this one's yours, I'm backing you, this one's yours. So I did go up to the house and call the pipeline company. So, okay, yeah, this isn't going to work. We just have to tell them. They just don't know really that we're here, right? They just draw those lines. Somebody in some office looked at some maps and they drew a line, shortest line probably from here to there. They just don't know where you're. I just have to tell them. That's all. And I called them up and I got, after, please hold for so and so and so, and then, please hold after like 6 of those. Finally, I get the pipeline route coordinator and get her, and I explained it to her, and she really just said, it doesn't matter that you're organic. It doesn't matter if you have a lot of costs. I'm going to have to get a little education here. And I went online and said, how does this whole thing work? And I found the agricultural impact mitigation plan. If any of you have a pipeline on your property, There was some agricultural impact mitigation plan in place when they put it there. This is the document that's supposed to manage how the whole process works, how they come in and dig up your soil and do all they gotta do to put the pipeline in there, do their wells, bring their heavy machinery in, blah, 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 pack it down, et cetera, and put it all back together just like it was before so you can go back and farm it. Okay. I was like, well, how am I going to do that? It doesn't sound like anything I know about. It's like I didn't see anything about soil moving there. So I start reading it, and I come across MinCan pipeline will not knowingly allow more than 12 inches of topsoil erosion. Can you imagine that's their mitigation plan, and they're saying that to an organic farmer? And this, by the way, I went and measured, was only 7 inches. How'd you like to have, not knowingly, more than 12 inches of soil erosion on your farm? After all you have done as organic farmers? That's when I got mad. That's when I started saying to myself, like 10 times a day, I'm going to get those, Okay, so I was like, okay, if I'm going to have to deal with this, I'm going to need an attorney. I pick up the phone, I get this eminent domain attorney list in the Twin Cities, I start calling down the line, one call after the next call. They all said the same thing. Excuse me, let me put you on hold, let me check our records, and they'd come back and they'd say, I'm sorry, we can't help you, we have a conflict of interest. I went through like 45 law offices. I was told by every one of them that they had a conflict of interest. Well, what does that mean? That Koch Industries went in and gave $2,000, $10,000 for a retainer? So they couldn't represent anyone else on this line? And finally, I reached Paula McAbee, attorney, and I gave her my, by now, very well-practiced spiel about being a farm, and she said, crude oil pipeline, organic farm, 12 inches of topsoil erosion? This is going to be fun. So our very first meeting that we had, Paula and I, we sat down to talk about what our goals would be. And I asked her if we could stop the pipeline altogether. What would it take, I said, to stop this pipeline altogether? And she said, well, all we have to do is prove that society doesn't need it. I was like, we can do that. Look at these statistics on organic farming systems. Look how much energy we're going to save if everybody farms organically. You wouldn't need it. I thought I was really brilliant there, right? She said, good idea. How many organic farmers are there in the United States? Well, in 2008, there were 12,941 certified operations out of 2 million farmers. And that, by the way, includes the processors. So that farmers are actually less than that. So what kind of message is that sending to the USDA or the Public Utilities Commission? Could I really say our country was ready when only less than 1% of the land was in organic systems? So we realized pretty quickly that argument wasn't going to work. And so we set 3 goals. The first one was that organic farms are actually a natural environment. The organic standards say that they are. And so we decided that we would argue that an organic farm is a valuable natural resource, like a wetland, that needs to be protected as such. The soils and the certification. That was one goal. Our second goal was that organic farms would be avoided when feasible. This was at a state level, so this is the state of Minnesota. And our third goal was that the pipeline and pumping station would not be placed on the Gardens of Egan. It would go along the road instead of crossing through people's fields. So that was our legal argument. We intervened in the legal proceeding. It was Gardens of Egan was a party to the case, the Department of Commerce, and the MinCan pipeline. There were 3 parties to the case. We got to do discovery just like the pipeline company did. We got to ask them questions, they asked us questions. And that being intervened in the legal proceeding was actually really a smart strategy that my lawyer came up with because we were parties to the case. This wasn't some process where we could win and then they could appeal. We were parties to the case, so they weren't going to get their routing permit until whatever happened with us was resolved. They're motivated to get their routing permit. And we, on the legal process, brought in expert witnesses. We had Jim Riddle for discussing organic certification and how that could be negatively impacted. We worked with the Department of Agriculture. One of the things that really surprised me in this legal process was that I actually had allies everywhere in places I would have never guessed. The Department of Ag was incredible. They have the job of managing and overseeing the agricultural impact mitigation plan. And when I called them up and said, this impact mitigation plan is not going to address the needs of an organic farm, we have to write an organic appendix that gets applied to this to meet those needs, they said, well, tell me about it. Why is organic different? How will you be differently impacted? So they really worked with us and negotiated with the pipeline company on what we had to add to an organic appendix to address organic farms' needs. And guess what? There is not 12 inches of topsoil erosion allowed in the organic appendix. There is none. No erosion is allowed. So that was a really fascinating process, and a small aside is that for some silly reason, I never thought about my organic plan, my organic system plan that every one of us certified organic farmers must write. That is a third-party inspected, that's why you're with OCIA, federally registered document. How's that for credibility in a court of law? That's not hearsay, me saying, well, I do this, I do that. That's very solid evidence. And for some reason, I didn't think to bring it into the legal proceeding, and the pipeline company asked for it. In one of their discovery questions, they required us to bring it forward. And that was really a wonderful moment for me because I wrote a very detailed plan. And the one that really made the pipeline company upset was that we grow tomatoes on our farm. So one of our biggest risks, as farmers, we're all risk managers, is a disease called tobacco mosaic. And it can be transferred on the body of people that have tobacco smoke on their body. They don't even have to smoke. They could have walked into a smoky place, have smoke on their body, and transfer it to the fields. There is no known cure for tobacco mosaic. You lose your crop. There's no chemical cure. There's no organic cure. The only thing you can do is prevent it from coming onto your farm. It lives in the soil for 50 years. Prevention is it. So our organic system plan says we manage this disease by not allowing people with smoke on their body to enter our farm. Can you imagine what it would be like to run a pipeline crew and not allow people smoke on their body? So they really fought that one, but I could say, well, you know, it's in my organic system plan, so if you want to come on my farm, I guess you're going to have to do it. Sorry. The other thing that we did, besides working on this organic mitigation plan for Minnesota, was we went to our customers. These were these people that we had fed. We had this relationship with, and we said, would you please write a letter to the judge? And just tell the judge how you will be impacted if you were to lose this source of food. What would happen to you? How would your lives be changed? These letters were amazing. They were from doctors talking about chemically sensitive patients they had who found they couldn't eat food from the store. This was like the only food that they were able to eat that made a difference in them getting well. They were from families talking about 3 generations that had eaten from this farm, or that they planned their family reunion every single year for the middle of August so they could have gardens of vegan sweet corn. 4,600 people wrote a letter to the judge. So how could the pipeline company compensate 4,600 people? We could argue with them in court about some financial compensation for us to farm, but these people expressed a loss. And so we accomplished all 3 of the goals that we were after. But what I saw through the process that we accomplished that was actually much larger than those goals being accomplished was that we actually educated the Public Utilities Commission and the judge about what is organic, how is it different. And I didn't realize that when I was in that moment of running down there and calling my husband, he's the one that should call him, I I thought, at that moment, I thought, what do I know about pipelines? I don't know anything about the Public Utilities Commission. I didn't recognize at that moment that I actually was an expert on organic farming. It's what I've done my whole life. That's what my expertise is. The Public Utilities Commission knows about pipelines, but they don't know about organic farming. And that really was my opportunity and my role as a citizen to talk to the Public Utilities Commission and educate them, to talk to the judge. Every one of those 4,600 letters was talking to the judge of the Public Utilities Commission. She had to read all those letters. She got a heck of an education. And the fascinating thing was, she added things to that routing permit that we hadn't even thought to ask for. But because we educated her, she knew to add them. The one that I really loved is she added that any person on the route that has that easement across their property has the right to say, I don't want chemicals used on my easement. Didn't matter if they were a farm or a home, organic or a conventional farmer, they had the right to say, don't use herbicide when you're managing my easement here, don't use chemicals. That's unprecedented. If anyone has a power line on your property, you probably have dealt with those companies coming in and wanting to spray herbicides. And when you say don't spray an herbicide on organic, they then turn to the farmer and say, okay, then you have to take on the cost of keeping these weeds down. So that concept of educator is really what I want to leave you with. I want to ask you to do 3 things. The first is to be sure that you are addressing regenerative practices, including biological diversity in your systems. We know that the organic standards say you must do this, but we also know that not everyone does. And it makes a big difference. Even adding 1 species at some point in your year is a big improvement over land that has 1 crop species and is kept bare all winter, which is the norm in our agricultural world. We know the norm isn't good enough. We know that. So be sure you're looking at your own farm and asking yourself, how can I do regeneration? How can I include biological diversity? How can I make a niche for it as part of that system? And 2, tell your story. This is how you educate in a way that's real to people, that they can identify with and take into their own lives and changes people. That's what changes behavior, is the stories. They don't have to be big stories. It can be something you noticed when you got up at 4 in the morning, you were out there and the world was quiet and everyone else was still sleeping, something that happened on your farm. It can be a big story too. It can be any kind of story. To talk to people. Educating them about what you do and doing it in a positive way that doesn't frighten people and push them away. Part of your daily life. And the 3rd thing I ask is that you find ways to empower and lead people. They are benefiting from this land that you're taking care of. It's not just you and the land, you're the link. You're the link between the people that benefit from the land and the land itself. And that land, and all the components of that land, the animals that live upon it, the water that runs through it, all those things that we affect every single day in our lives as farmers. Very important that you talk to them about that.